All right, so we're now into week 6 of the semester, and this week we take up the topic of examining a social welfare program. And to do so, we're going to rely primarily on the Dolgoff reading that you all had for this week, where Professor Dolgoff lays out a basic schema, or essentially a framework that we're to use in describing our selected policies and programs. And so let's start with a quick outline for this two-part lecture. In the first part of this lecture, we'll take a look at APA-style formatting, and by APA, I'm referring to the American Psychological Association and their publication manual that we should be using to write our scholarly policy-related papers this semester. And so we'll take a look at some of the basic rules that we should be following in the way of writing those papers. And in the second part of this lecture, we'll take a look at Professor Dolgoff's schema, his framework that we're to use also in writing our papers. And so Professor Dolgoff recommends that we start with some basic structural components, namely essentially there are 5 dimensions that we should be commenting on in the way of describing our policies and programs with respect to the benefit structure, eligibility, rules, and the financing and how that works. So we'll talk about that first. And then he also notes some alternative or additional characteristics that we should also comment on. And so we're not going to use all those dimensions, but we should, I'd like us to use 3 of those dimensions. So we'll select out 3 of those dimensions that we can use for our papers. And then finally, we'll conclude with talking about program evaluation, not necessarily program evaluation, but evaluating our chosen policies and programs on the basis of this one criterion that Professor Dolgoff has offered, and that's in the way of both horizontal and vertical adequacy. Now, let me just note that this is not a course in program evaluation or really policy analysis for that matter. Those terms are really have quite specific meanings. They're quite loaded terms, actually. And so that's really the content, policy analysis that is, that's the content for your second semester policy courses. And so we're not diving into that material quite yet, but we'll just do a quick evaluation just looking at the adequacy, assessing the adequacy of our chosen policies and programs for this project. But first, let's start with APA-style formatting. And so by APA, of course, we're talking about the American Psychological Association and their publication manual, essentially their guide. It's a writing tool that's being offered in the way of writing effective scholarly papers. And so just note that it's not the only form of scholarly writing. There's certainly other ways that we can write our papers. We can use MLA style. Many students come in with a background in MLA style formatting. There's a Chicago style. There's numerous ways in which we can write scholarly papers, and this is just one of those different ways. But probably the most commonly used among social work students and professionals, and so we follow that formatting. And so this is not only just a writing tool, but it also helps us in the way of citing our sources. So any idea that you use in your papers, the basic notion is that we should be giving credit where credit is due. If you didn't come up with that idea, you need to cite the source, and so APA offers recommendations on how to best cite those sources. And so let's dive in here to looking at some of those basic rules that APA publishes. So first, note that there are various sections to writing your paper. Of course, there's a title page, there's an abstract, there's the main text of your papers, and then of course there's the reference list. And so let me just note that for this paper, we're going to have a title page, the main text certainly, and we'll have a reference list, but an abstract is not required for this paper. Okay, and so I'm not going to comment on the rules for putting together an abstract using APA-style formatting. And so first, let's dive into thinking about the title of your papers. So APA has some specific suggestions on how to format your title pages, and so they say that you should have the title of your paper centered on the first page of your paper, and then immediately after the title, you should be inserting the names of your group members. And so that's all centered on the first page of your paper. And then immediately underneath, you should write in the university affiliation, in this case, of course, Northeastern Illinois University. Now, it can get a little more complicated when you have authors from different universities, but certainly not for our projects for this class. Now, a couple of other quick notes. On that first page, on that title page, page numbering should be on the top right. We should start page numbering on that first page at the top right corner. And then the top left corner, we should have a header, our very first header. So on that first page, the words running head, the actual words running head should appear on that first page. Students sometimes write in running header just thinking about the common term there, thinking about the headers, but really you should have the words running head, not header, using both upper and lowercase on that first page, followed by a colon, and then you should write an abbreviated version of your title on that first page also. Now, the abbreviated version of your title should be in all capital letters, and all of that, the running head should not be more than 50 characters in length. So those are some of the basic rules that pertain to the title page of your papers. Now, in thinking about the main body of your paper, so I'm thinking that most of you will bring in certain quotations, or maybe you might be paraphrasing from different sources that you're using for your papers. We have rules that pertain to short quotations, rules that pertain to long quotations or block quotations, and then we have some APA rules that pertain to summarizing or paraphrasing your sources. And so first, in the way of short quotations, so by way of example here, note that here's the idea that you're citing. So there's some idea that you want to use from a different source, from a different author, and you want to bring that in, and you want to bring it in word for word, verbatim. And so you're going to go ahead and use quotation marks and follow up that quote, right? You're going to use quotation marks, follow up the quote with parentheses, and you want to note the author's last name. So the last name only appears, and then the year of publication, and then the page from which that source derives. And then notice here that the punctuation, so that period here in this case is going to follow the parentheses. So it's not before the parentheses, but it's after the parentheses. Those are the rules for the short quotations. For the long quotations, we're talking about where you're wanting to use some language from a different source that's 5 or more sentences, or let me say 5 or more lines. And so we call that a block quote. What you'll do, if you want to use that exact language, you're going to pull in that language, that block quote, and you're going to indent everything, right? So all lines from that quote should be indented. We say, so APA is saying 5 spaces, and there's no need for quotation marks. So unlike short quotations, there's no need for quotation marks here in the way of long quotations. And so after that block quote, you're going to go ahead and cite the source here. And so once again, in parentheses, the last name of the author, the year of publication, and then the page from which that source is derived. And notice here that the punctuation, whereas we had the period after the parentheses before, we're going to go ahead and put the period before the parentheses in the case of block quotes, is what APA is recommending. And then finally, there might be a case where you're not using the exact language that was offered by another author, but you might be summarizing or paraphrasing an idea from a different source. And so when you do so, let's say here's the idea here. You'll go ahead and bring in that idea. So no quotation marks needed, obviously. And then you're going to go ahead and in parentheses, you'll note the author's last name, the author who offered up that idea, the year of publication. And then APA says that you may, right? So that's APA's language. So you may also include the page number, but not necessarily required. Okay, and so if you want, you can go ahead and put in the page number here, but notice also that we have the punctuation similar to how we had it in the case of short quotation, so that that period should be after the parentheses as opposed to before the parentheses. So basic rules for the main body of the text. All right, and then we have the last part of the paper, and that's your reference list, right? So, sometimes students refer to this list as the bibliography. So in that reference list, on that page, the word reference, I should say references, should appear centered at the top. And so you shouldn't boldface it, you shouldn't underline it. It's regular lettering, so in the way of font. So we're not going to boldface, no underlining. And then, of course, you want to make sure you maintain double spacing throughout the reference list, as you've done throughout the entire paper. And then note that you want to make sure that all the sources that you're citing in your paper, in the main body of your text, should also go in the reference list, and they should be alphabetized. Okay? And so within each source, within each source that you're citing, we have what's called a hanging indentation, and that's where you have the first line. The first line is left justified. Okay, you have a left justification in terms of the first line, and every line thereafter for each source is going to be indented. We call that, that's what we're calling hanging indents. Okay, and so some basic rules for the reference page. So let me give some examples. This might be helpful for students. So we have some examples from different sources that you might use for your papers. Most notably, students typically use journal articles. They might use web pages, right? And then, of course, lecture material. I have a note here on lecture material. So first, in the way of articles. Okay, so notice the formatting that's used here. We have the last name. So you have the reference list. You have the last name of the authors. And notice here that we have initials. We're using initials as opposed to the full names of the authors, and that distinguishes APA-style formatting from different formats. But we're using initials here, and then followed by the year of publication, right? So the year of publication sometimes appears at the end of a source, but now we're going to put it in the beginning of the source, right after the author's last names. And then notice here you have the name of the article, the actual title of the article. And so you have here both in uppercase and lowercase. It's not all capitalized. That's the name of the article. And then here is the name of the journal from which that article is derived. And so this really should be italicized. It's not shown here, but it should be in italics. And then you have the journal number, that's 45, and that should also be italicized. The journal name and the volume number should be italicized. This is the issue number in parentheses. That should not be italicized. And then you have the page numbers at the end. Okay, so that's for journal articles. And then you have web pages, so similar format, last names of the authors with authors' initials, and then the year of publication in parentheses to start out. And then you have the title of the document. Notice that the entire title of the document is in fact capitalized, unlike the title of the article that we had before. And then, of course, you want to provide a URL or a web address from which you pulled that source. Okay, and then finally, I'm just offering up a note here about lecture content. So you don't want to cite lecture content or personal communications for that matter. We're treating lecture content as a personal communication. And so the basic rule that pertains to a personal communication is that those shouldn't be included in your reference list. They should just simply be cited in the main body of your text using this format here. And so let's say you have a personal communication. You went out and did some interviews and you want to use some of that interview content. You will go ahead and paraphrase what the person said. And then in parentheses, you'll cite the source, right? Author's first name, the initials, and then the last name, and then the name of that communication, or put a title on that communication, and then the data of that communication is how you should be citing personal communications or interviews that you've conducted outside of class. All right, so those are some basic rules that we should be following in putting together our papers, and namely our reference list for next week. And so if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me, or a good source for recommendations or tips on how to put together a good reference list using APA-style formatting is simply from the University of Purdue website. Their English department puts out this website. And so here's the website that you can reference if you have additional questions. All right, so in the second part of this lecture, we'll go ahead and dive into the Dolgoff framework.